Turkey has launched an investigation into a leading media group.
O da istikrarsızlık yaratıyor. Türk siyasetinde çok istikrarsız olarak bir döneme dönüştü. İkincisi vurgulayacağım.
In Turkey, the press can't afford to take chances. Office windows
walk around the town of Cizre pretty quickly, you see the effect of days of violence here.
Hello there, I'm Barbara Sarah and you're at The Listening Post. Here are some of the media stories that we're tracking this week. Raids, arrests, threats, deportation. Journalism in Turkey is becoming more and more dangerous. A Thai journalist gets called in for an attitude adjustment by the military. Has it worked? Understanding the Bosnian media landscape, the history that divides and the challenges today. Plus, sorry doesn't seem to be the hardest word.
I'm truly sorry.
At least not in South Africa's media. These are tense times in Turkey. The southeast of the country is seeing the worst violence in decades as the Turkish military and Kurdish separatists, led by the PKK, battle each other. Entire cities in the southeast, Diyarbakir and Cizre, have been put under curfew. And for journalists, both Turkish and Kurdish, both in the southeast and beyond, the situation has become nearly impossible to cover. Just this past week, Turkish prosecutors started investigating one of the country's largest media houses, Dogan Media Group, for, quote, terrorism propaganda. Earlier this month, 3 journalists from New York-based Vice News were arrested in Diyarbakir for, quote, working for a terrorist organization. Then there's the Nokta news magazine, whose offices were raided, and the latest edition banned on charges of both insulting the president and making terrorist propaganda. All of this comes as Turkey heads for its second general election in November, pitting the AKP, that's the party of President Erdogan, and Prime Minister Davutoglu against the opposition, notably the Kurdish HDP. The Listening Post's Marcella Pizarro now on the battles in Turkey that are being fought not just in the southeast, not just between rival political groups, but across the media. Our starting point is Istanbul.
The president of Turkey says his country is under attack. It's not just the Kurdish fighters, terrorists in the government's lexicon. It's also foreign forces and their collaborators, the media.
Biz Türkiye'yi nasıl böleriz? Türkiye'de nasıl huzursuzluğun zeminini oluştururuz bunun gayretinin içine girdik. Tabii bir de medya ayağı var. Onlar da teröristleri, cici çocuk, güvenlik güçlerini saldırgan olarak göstermek için her türlü çabayı gösteriyor.
Erdoğan hepimizin aynı şeyi söylemesini istiyor.
Erdogan wants all of us to say the same thing, and that pressure was ramped up after June elections. Since then, we have seen a series of attacks on the media. Today in Turkey, anyone who published even so much as a sentence the government doesn't like could be accused of colluding with the enemy. People can be arrested for things they've written on Twitter about the president. And none of us are ever very far away from being labelled as IS or PKK supporters.
Duyma yönünde.
Şu dönemde
Right now, we're in a struggle against IS and the terrorist PKK organization. At such times, all around the world, you can see the media act together in the national interests. But in Turkey, under the pretext of free speech, the media's conduct is just unbelievable. They're operating against the country's interests. People create false headlines purely to oppose President Erdogan's leadership. And those very people also publish news in support of the terrorist groups. This doesn't happen anywhere else in the world.
müsaade edilmez.
The heat has been rising steadily between Erdogan and the media in Turkey. Over the last 4 years, Turkish media have seen repeated newsroom raids, multiple arrests, lawsuits against journalists. Throughout, Erdogan has maintained that Turkey's media climate is the envy of the world.
Türkiye'de medya o kadar serbesttir ki demokratik ülkelerde dahi asla müsaade edilmeyen hakareti, iftirayı, karalamayı, ırkçılığı ve nefret suçlarını her gün işleyebilmektedir.
That claim has become something of a joke in media circles, more so since the general elections in June, where the AK party saw a dramatic loss in votes and the pro-Kurdish party, the HDP, came into national prominence. The heat has been turned up further after a 3-year ceasefire was broken and violence flared in the southeast between Kurdish fighters and the Turkish military. Cevheri Güven is the editor of a weekly news magazine, Nokta. This past week, his office was raided, an editor taken to court, and the magazine's latest edition banned because of the front cover that had been tweeted the night before.
Every Sunday at 9 p.m, we post the cover of the latest edition on social media. Our cover showed President Erdogan taking a selfie against a backdrop of a martyr's coffin carried by other soldiers. He had said earlier in the week that being a martyr was something to find happiness and joy in. People take selfies when they are happy. We were being ironic, but the government has come after us with terrorism charges, which we think are unfair and unlawful.
Erdogan's continued assertions that the media in Turkey has its freedom is a product of a particular culture in this country, that you are blessed for what you have because things could be worse. It can almost be seen as a kind of threat. So when Erdogan is saying that you are free and there is a free media in Turkey, he is making a threat, implying that he can restrict the media even more if he wants to.
The AKP election strategy is focused on nationalist votes. Any criticism from the families of fallen soldiers, martyrs, can seriously damage nationalist sentiment. Therefore, the AKP wants to silence those reports written about dead soldiers and police members' families berating the government for their loss.
On September the 6th, the offices of Hürriyet, the mass circulation newspaper, were vandalized by protesters. They claimed a tweet from the paper had misquoted the president. 9 days later, prosecutors launched an investigation into the Dogan Media Group on charges of terrorist propaganda. Dogan is one of the country's biggest media houses. It owns Hürriyet and part-owns CNN Turk. The investigation came after a front-page story in a pro-government paper, Güneş, that accused Hürriyet of publishing pictures of dead soldiers. The paper also referenced a 2014 interview on CNN Turk with a woman who later joined the PKK. This has become a growing trend in Turkey. Media outlets that report on other news outlets or journalists, accusing them of criminal activity. Earlier this month, 3 journalists working for the American Vice News network were arrested in Diyarbakir. 2 of them, the Westerners, then became the focus of an hour-long episode of the Yazboz news show on the ATV channel.
İçeride ve dışarıda PYD ile DAEŞ'i Türkiye'ye karşı örgütlüyorlardı.
While the 2 were released, the third journalist, an Iraqi, is still in jail.
We didn't claim that they were IS agents on our show. We just highlighted what the world media didn't question. Like how come the Vice reporters got into IS strongholds and were welcomed there.
Mediandaria gained exclusive access to their power base in Raqqa.
Other journalists have been beheaded in Raqqa, but they were kind of on holiday there. Vice News are doing IS propaganda.
During periods of conflict, the sharpest edge cuts against those who are working in the field, especially journalists. Out there is no one to go to for help. You have 2 options. Either run through the bullets and broadcast the news, or think about your safety and forget about reporting.
Lately, it has become almost impossible to get any accurate information regarding the operations in southeastern Turkey. It's not that the government has imposed censorship officially. It's just that an environment has been created in which the media are stifled and they are not even protesting the repression as loudly as before.
Not all journalists are keeping quiet.
HDP'lileri çıkarabiliyor muyuz? Çünkü çıkardığınız zaman otomatikman PKK'lı deniyorsunuz.
The upcoming elections are too crucial, and the fighting in the southeast too intense for the media on either side of the partisan divide to sit this one out.
All this is happening because there is an election soon. The current government sees it as an existential battle. And until the elections take place, the media will be seriously under attack. We have a couple of dark months ahead of us.
On the download this week, our viewers on the media battle in Turkey.
Let's take a look at the case of the prominent journalist Giri Cel. Now, Giri Cel was fired in July from his position as a columnist with the Daily Milliyet, a position that he had held for 8 years, over a tweet that he had posted that was critical of President Erdogan. Now, this was just one in a series of purges of critical journalists from Milliyet over the past couple of years. So today in Turkey, we have a situation where journalists take these types of things into consideration before they hit the tweet button.
Other media stories on our radar this week. In Thailand, when the military government summons a journalist for a talk, it calls it attitude adjustment sessions. In any other context, it would just be called detention without charge. That's what happened to journalist Pravit Rajanafruk. On September 13th, Rajanafruk, the editor of the English-language daily The Nation, was called by the country's ruling body, the National Council for Peace and Order. Rajanafruk has had run-ins with the government before, but he says this experience was unlike any other. He was blindfolded, taken to an undisclosed location in Bangkok, and held in a windowless room for 2 nights before being released. It was made clear to him that any criticism of the military is unacceptable. The government said that Rajanafruk was held because he had written articles that could, quote, cause confusion and misunderstandings and which go against the efforts to keep public order. Rajanafruk has been a vocal critic of the military coup last year and the government. Since his release, he has said he will resign from his paper, The Nation, to ease the pressure on the publication. Last week, we reported on the media coverage of the refugee crisis. We talked about how the image of Alan Kurdi, the Syrian refugee toddler whose body was washed up on a beach in Turkey, galvanized media around the world and forced a change in the tone of much of their refugee coverage. Well, that image is now at the heart of another media storm over how it's been depicted in a cartoon by French satirical magazine Charlie Hebdo. The cartoon has been lauded in some quarters as a clever critique of European society and their handling of the refugee crisis, but has been criticized by others who say that the use of the dead child's image is racist, in poor taste, and is a marketing gimmick. The chair of the UK-based Society of Black Lawyers said the group is considering legal action against the magazine for incitement to hate. Charlie Hebdo was at the center of a free speech firestorm earlier this year. It was the target of a violent attack which left 12 dead, 8 of them from the magazine. In Colombia, the murder of a journalist has been caught on camera, stark evidence of the dangers to the media there. On September 10th, Flor Alba Núñez was shot in the head as she entered her radio station, La Preferida Estereo, in the city of Pitalito. The CCTV footage is a key piece of evidence for the authorities, who have announced a $35,000 reward for information on the killer. In more than 45% of investigations into the murders of journalists, however, there have been no charges, no arrests, and no trials. According to the Bogota-based Free Press Foundation, Núñez could have been targeted either for her reporting of robberies by a criminal gang or for her coverage of the run-up to the local elections next month. According to the Paris-based Reporters Without Borders, Núñez is the 3rd journalist to be killed in the country this year. 2 decades ago, the 3-year-long war in Bosnia and Herzegovina came to an end. Around 100,000 people had been killed and more than 1 million displaced. And in the complicated peace agreement, the Dayton Accords, that were signed in 1995, the country was split internally into 2 entities. The Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina, administered by Bosnian Muslims and Croats, and Republika Srpska, administered by Bosnian Serbs. This division created a convoluted political structure and also cut deeper grooves into a divided media landscape. The split is most evident when it comes to the coverage of unresolved topics like the Srebrenica massacre, one of the most violent events of the Bosnian War. The ethnic and national differences are evident in the reporting of such stories, but given the history, that's hardly breaking news. The more recent and growing media challenge in the country today is one that transcends the ethnic divide. It's political and economic pressures on news media that are skewing editorial focus and slanting the reporting of a multitude of stories. The Listening Post's Flo Phillips now from Sarajevo on the problems Bosnian journalists face on a daily basis, regardless of ethnicity, regardless of where they are based in the country.
Srebrenica, designated by the United Nations a safe haven in April 1993. It was turned into a burial site in a matter of days when thousands of Muslim men and boys were massacred at the hands of the Bosnian Serb army. This past July, tens of thousands of people, along with the world's media, poured into the memorial site to remember the worst atrocity on European soil since World War II. And Srebrenica is one of those subjects the Bosnian media still find difficult to cover. The ceasefire declared 20 years ago seems to have done little to affect the coverage on the airwaves and in the newspapers.
In Bosnia and Herzegovina, the war is not over. We've stopped conducting it using weapons, but we're continuing it on other platforms, especially the media. Srebrenica is reported today the same way it was reported 20 years ago. You have the same sentence structure, the same visual conceits, the same soundbite.
Srebrenica.
It's pretty tedious that all these years on we haven't managed to report Srebrenica differently.
There was some progress made in media in Bosnia and Herzegovina. 15 years ago, media in Republika Srpska would cover only the events where the Serbs were the victims. This year, for the first time, every single outlet, newspaper, every single media in Bosnia and Herzegovina finally covered Srebrenica.
It's important to understand exactly who everybody refers to. We interviewed 5 different journalists for this story. The editor-in-chief of Federal State Television based in the country's capital, a Bosnian Croat who edits a newspaper in Mostar, the editor of a web portal working in Republika Srpska, a journalist and media analyst from Sarajevo, and a Bosnian Serb newspaper editor based in Banja Luka. Different backgrounds, different perspectives on the same story, and with that comes different terminology.
The media in Republika Srpska don't use the word genocide, whereas in the Federation it's often overemphasized.
20 godina od genocida u Srebrenici.
At times it felt like the word genocide is mentioned in every sentence.
Od genocida Srebrenice.
Srebrenici desio genocid.
Whilst it wasn't heard in Republika Srpska.
Reporting is divided along ethnic lines. Given the population in the Federation is predominantly made up of Bosniak Muslims, the media coverage was very thorough. The newspaper, the Dnevni Avaz, published a 200-page special. They had everything that was related to Srebrenica. The media in Republika Srpska also reported on the event. If you saw the newspaper Nezavisne Novine, we had a black and white front page which we dedicated exclusively to the events of that day. You have to understand that there are significant differences between the two entities. The war in Bosnia and Herzegovina is over, but tension still persists.
When it comes to covering sensitive topics, the media serving the 3 main ethnic groups, Bosnian Muslim, Bosnian Serb, and Bosnian Croat, remain divided, often covering the same stories differently. But we've spoken to analysts across all 3 communities, and they say that the issues affecting journalism here go well beyond interpretations of the past, such as the Srebrenica story. The larger problem, they say, are the politics of the present. Fahrudin Radoncic is the owner of the country's most widely read daily newspaper, Dnevni Avaz. He's also the president of a major political party and Bosnia's former security minister. And Radoncic is just one example of an influential figure with one foot in politics, the other in media, and the potential to affect news coverage.
He's a politician, he has his media, basically. He has a TV, he has like everything. Second good example is maybe from Republika Srpska, where media are receiving help from the government directly, and they're completely writing, many of the media, and what you read in these media is like literally what these politicians from the biggest party in that part of the country, so SNSD, are telling.
Politicians, businessmen, they call, they threat, they sue me, and it exhausts you completely. They just do not come to my show. They would go to some other media to give the interviews or to be in the debates where the journalist is softer.
Vi ste, evo, prije 5 godina počeli pričati o ekonomiji dok su drugi pričali o nacionalizmu.
ready to make the compromises, raise the issues which the politicians like.
It's a similar story on the Serbian side in Banja Luka. 2 years ago, the National Assembly of Republika Srpska adopted legislation allowing for the public broadcaster RTRS to be financed directly through the government, contravening the law that public broadcasters can only be financed through taxes or advertising revenue, and exposing the channel to potential editorial manipulation. This cosy relationship is symbolized by the proximity between state and studio. On one side of the building you have the state headquarters of Republika Srpska. On the other, the studios of the state-owned broadcaster, RTRS.
Radio Televizija Republika Srpska is a typical example of a public service in Bosnia and Herzegovina that has supported the ruling political party from the moment of its conception. Public services were the first to succumb to political pressure. They became political puppets, creating an environment that made it very difficult for private media to stay independent in the economic market, in turn making it uncomfortable for any outlet to publish a story which criticizes those who make it possible for them to publish in the first place.
I work as an executive editor and we criticize the current Croatian ruling party every day. That is our job, but as a result of our reporting, we often face the loss of subscriptions, the loss of advertising, and even physical threats. The government control jobs, they control employment, they control people's lives.
The governments born in the aftermath of the Bosnian War were control-hungry. But it's been almost 2 decades since the Dayton Peace Accord officially brought the war to an end. A pretty long time for any government to be using political instability as an argument for control. In times like these, the media often trot out truisms about failing to learn lessons from the past. But that doesn't seem to be the case in Bosnia and Herzegovina, at least not at the political level.
The local politicians, current politicians, they learn a lot from the past. They learn how to use the media as their propaganda tools. And they learn that lesson very well. I think that they all have PhD in political propaganda. Unfortunately, I'm not sure that the public learned the lesson from the war. And I'm not sure that they learn how to recognize political propaganda in every occasion.
Finally, in South Africa, President Jacob Zuma has been having a tough time with the media. He's in the headlines for all the wrong reasons, be it the controversy over the use of millions of dollars of public funds to renovate his private homestead, to flack for not arresting Sudanese President Omar al-Bashir when he was in South Africa and handing him over to the International Criminal Court to be tried over alleged war crimes. Well, despite the bad press, Zuma isn't without sympathizers in the media. Last month, the editor of the Citizen newspaper, that's a popular national daily, apologized to Zuma in an op-ed for what he called a sinister agenda in the media against the president. The article caused a stir, lots of reaction online and off, a few more articles on the media and its relationship with the government, and then another op-ed, a letter with another apology. This one came from Alex Elisiv, a well-known reporter in South Africa, who said that if the media are going to apologize, well, then the apology should look like this. We'll see you next time at The Listening Post.
Dear South Africa, I'm sorry. I'm sorry that there are not more of us, reporters who don't apologize for doing our job. I'm sorry that journalists are being retrenched as newspapers cut down circulation or shut down titles. I'm sorry that newsrooms aren't comprised of hundreds of hacks fighting each other for a chance to get onto the front page or to lead a bulletin with a big exclusive story. I'm sorry about what is happening to some media ownership and how it's impacting content. Sometimes what you're being offered is nothing short of intellectual fraud. I'm sorry that issues like mob justice, xenophobia, or taxi violence are not explored more deeply and consistently, or that labor issues explode only when there's a strike or a sex scandal. I'm sorry that we make mistakes. We do. At times, rather embarrassing ones. But since we're not robots, these things do and will happen. What's most important is how we deal with them. And for every mistake, I assure you, there are 100 good pieces that go out there. I'm sorry that we haven't been more critical of Jacob Zuma and his government. While these scandals have kept us busy, from Nkandla to Mine Thuli, there are many other areas we should be paying more attention to.